Hi, I am going to give a short lecture today about networks in small groups and sort of how they work, what we know, what we don't know. A lot of this comes from the one of the readings, but hopefully there's a little bit more of an accessible introduction to some of these ideas. I think to kind of preface why it's so important to understand this, really a lot of our lives, a lot of the time that we spend and our communication happens in the context of small groups. So this is, from families to class groups, roommates, friendship groups, and work groups. Really often we are in these sorts of contexts of volunteer organizations. It's really important to understand how they work. There are a lot of network theories that we've already talked about, we will continue to talk about, that relate to the structure of small groups. Things like triadic closure, right? So this is, that A and B are friends, and so and B and C are friends, and therefore A and C are likely to be friends. Ideas about reciprocity, homophily, etc., all relate to what groups look like. So they sort of scale up, and this sort of idea about understanding kind of individual level decisions, individual level, structures and processes for how those edges are formed, when they dissolve, can help us understand the next level up, and the next level is small groups, and then understanding how small groups interact with each other and how people move in and out of small groups helps us understand how things happen at larger levels, organizations or societies. So one of the key questions of small groups research is like, what works? What sorts of network make it a group effective? We might have a network where everyone's connected to each other, or very few people are. When do networks work best? And unsurprisingly, probably, a lot of the money for research has been in studying work groups in particular. And so that's where a lot of this research shows up. It's harder in some respects, to think about how to measure what a friendship group is effective, for example. So some of these, a lot of the rest of what I'll talk about is focused sort of on you can think of it as like a class group or a work group, when a group that's trying to work together to get something done. So I want you to pause for a second, think about which of these network types do you think would be most effective at meeting its goals. So in the first one, this is called a star network. There's one person in the middle, and everyone's connected to that one person. The second is a ring network, so people are connected to a ring. And the third is a full network, where everyone is connected to everyone. Each of these is a network of 6 people. So pause, think about what you think would be most effective and why. Okay, now that you've come back, the answer is it really depends. It really depends on the task that the group is working on. You might think that the star network would always be better because you could sort of tell everyone what to do. You might think that the full network would always be better, but it really depends. In short, centralization is beneficial for simple tasks. So a centralized network is like that star network. You can think, there's one person in the center, right? There's a center and a periphery. So for simple tasks where it's just like organize things, for example, delegate who does what, this one person in the middle can do that and do it effectively. But decentralization is beneficial for a lot of the types of tasks that we often do in groups. So complex tasks, or tasks when information is scattered, when it's really about getting the information, aggregating it, figuring it out together. It's really important that there's connections and possibilities for people to be heard. Which is a lot of our lives today. And finally, those rings are pretty bad in both types of tasks, right? Because it's better, there's information can get from everyone to everyone, but it sort of has a long way to go. There are, of course, downsides, right? So maybe the question that's worth thinking about a second is, why wouldn't that full network where everyone's connected to everyone be the best always? And I think many of us have probably experienced this, that in some cases, it's better for someone to be in charge. It can make things faster. A related problem is that there can be kind of information overload. That when everyone can talk to everyone, it can sort of become a cacophony instead of a harmony, instead of a melody. And so there are dangers to having too much connection, right? There's a reason, for example, that we don't have like a Purdue-wide, Slack channel that anyone can write on, because sometimes there can be too much, and it can actually hurt. Okay, so the problem. So the reason, maybe I'll give a little context that I forgot to give. This research from before that I showed. These networks were. The way that they learned about which was most effective was by putting people in these networks and sort of sitting them in cubicles and saying, you can only talk to this person, you can only talk to this person. And so they determined who could talk to who. They put people in these communication networks, and we will hopefully get a chance to do an activity around that a little bit later. They constrained who could talk to who. But in reality, I don't want to move past, that's usually not the way that our networks work, right? That communication networks both represent and enable patterns of communication. In other words, we choose who we talk to, but then once we've made that choice, once we've built relationships, it's much easier to talk to that person in the future, right? So it's not an unconstrained choice. We can't just choose to get information from anyone at any time, because the patterns we've made in the past make it much easier. Having relationships changes that. And so they usually aren't mandated, but they also aren't completely free, that the past influences the present. And some constraints still influence it as well, right? Like who you report to, who your boss is at work, who you've been assigned to be in a group with, obviously in a school group. Those things obviously are big constraints. Okay, so apart from those sorts of kind of higher level, top-down constraints, why do edges exist in small groups? What are some of the purposes and the processes that cause them? And some of these will be familiar from last week, but so one version is that people are trying to build social capital. This is there's some individualistic versions that people make relationships with each other in a way to, and we'll talk a lot about social capital, but the main idea is that helps them to get access to the resources that others have. A second very related is social exchange. This idea is that it's more dyadic instead of sort of a relationship with a group. It's about an individual, and you sort of think at all times like, am I benefiting more from this relationship than I'm putting into it, sort of, or might I in the future benefit more than I'm putting into it? So it's pretty instrumental, but I think that some relationships certainly work like that. A third that they bring up in the reading is this idea of collective action, that we may build relationships with each other because we would benefit together from some collective, from some action that's taken. If we band together, then we may have opportunities to reach that goal. A fourth, and one that is kind of unique to small groups, I think, is this idea of transactive memory, which I think is just fascinating. But the idea is that the groups that operate well, that one of the purposes of communication in groups is to figure out not what everyone knows, but who knows what. I'll try and make that distinction. Instead of information passing through communication, that everyone sort of understands everything that needs to go on. Instead, we learn, and often in many cases, kind of who is good at what, who knows what, and so that helps us to sort of delegate things, to know who to go to. If you have a friend who's like really good at I don't know, this is silly, but at Brightspace, right? They know all about it, and if you get lost and you can't figure out where your class is or where to turn in the homework assignment, then they always know about that, or maybe more broadly knows a lot about computers, and so that's who you go to for that. and you have another friend that really is a foodie and knows about all the best restaurants in town, and so you go to that person for that. And so you don't necessarily know that information, and you don't want them to tell me all the best restaurants and I'll write it down and I'll reach out to you every week to update my list. No, you just, when you need information, you go to that person to get the information. So that's the idea of transactive memory. I think it's a really neat idea, and obviously this happens in work groups as well, that people have expertise, and sort of communication helps us to identify and to learn and update our map of who has what expertise. That's the idea. In general, I think that the second wave of research that looked at looks at we take those processes and look at what actual networks get produced in the real world and which ones are related to effectiveness. Found pretty similar things. I mean, in the real world, I think we mostly have complex tasks. And in general, these sort of integrative groups perform better. So what's interesting is that density, so this idea that everyone's connected to everyone, actually is not. It's sort of tough to tell if that's helpful or harmful, and it probably depends on the context. But a few things are usually helpful. One is low hierarchy. They call these integrative groups in a paper by Cummings and Cross. So low hierarchy, in other words, it's not top down. So that's the way they measure this in a directed network is whether there are loops back. Is it just one person talks to everyone and then they talk down to their subordinates, or are there ways for subordinates to communicate back up the chain? So when that's possible, groups do better when there's low hierarchy, and also when there are few people in the periphery. This is related but different, that there aren't people who really aren't connected to hardly anyone else, that most people are connected to at least a few others. So in those groups, so why might this be? And there are some theories about why this is, why these groups work so well. One is that it allows people to coordinate, that you can, because there are connections to everyone and connections back to the top, information flows and moves. And so they're able to coordinate what they do. They also, people are more motivated, right? That we've all felt on the periphery of a group. And it doesn't make you want to contribute to that group's goals. If, on the other hand, you are, everyone's connected, everyone feels integrated, then you're more willing to help out. I mean, one silly example is if you are in a school group with someone on a class project, and you're all friends outside of class, then it's really a lot harder to slack off, right? Because you're part of this group. You each care about the outcomes of the other person, and you care about the outcomes of the group. And so that's one example of why you might be more motivated. So that's kind of the thrust of that research. The other kind of final idea, which I wanted to bring up today, is this idea that it's groups are also embedded. We try to look at them in isolation, partially because that's much easier, but that they are part of a larger context. So one is what's their purpose, right? Is this a work group? Is it a school assignment? Are these relationships permanent or temporary? And a lot of that can really affect how people approach the group, and then what the network of the group ends up looking like, and whether it's effective. The people are not part of just one group, and understanding the relationships of how they bring in information or norms, etc., about how they act. This is related to some of the kind of research that we're trying to do on online groups. How does it matter when we consider how people belong to different groups? And then the influence of the environment. It's tricky. I mean, it's the reason that we haven't done this is because it's just important. We know that it's important to understand, how groups are embedded in larger contexts and the relationships with other groups, etc. But it's just pretty hard to study. And so, but it's important to remember and to think about, conceptually as we try to understand, how a group performs and what it does. So that's it. That's a few thoughts about online groups. I encourage you to do the readings and look forward to our conversation.